fire philosophy, Nietzsche, Zen, and how to live.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm here with Christoph. We have a special guest today, Michelle Huneven, author of 6 novels, all with intriguing 1- or 2-word titles like Round Rock, James Land, Plame, of course, Search, but now Bug Hollow. Michelle teaches creative writing at UCLA, and having worked her way through the amazing Iowa Writers Workshop, she has for many years been a writer. She's won awards of all kinds, including a Guggenheim National Book Critics Circle Award, James Beard Award, highly prestigious awards, and many others. Michelle's a highly regarded food and restaurant critic in Los Angeles. She's also an astonishingly great gourmet chef, a knowledgeable gardener, a lover of hikes, animals, and many friends, including, I'm so lucky, me. But in January, Michelle and her husband Jim, their newly remodeled, gorgeous Altadena home was burnt to the ground. This was an older, plain home on a huge lot in a beautiful part of Upper Altadena that they just reworked, and Michelle being a great cook, Jim being a great baker. The kitchen was beyond belief great. And they just had basically gotten it done when the Altadena fire took it to the ground, everything. So on fire philosophy, some of you may remember I've described people whose lives have been thoroughly overturned. I've said I had these friends, Michelle and Jim, foremost in mind. So I'm just trying to think, how's it possible to go from having this beautiful life to having it thoroughly overturned, where Michelle and Jim's life was just sculpted in every respect, every detail, and suddenly they're homeless and they have nothing but the clothes on their back. I've tried really hard to imagine that, but it's almost impossible to do. Michelle, would you be willing to talk about this? How has your life been radically changed by this unearthing, this undermining? How might you imagine it could change your life forever, this having happened? And how might it affect you as a writer going forth? Okay, so I know that's a lot to ask. I wouldn't ask that of many people, but I'm guessing you're up to it.
The first 3 months, I was stunned. Well, one of the first things I realized, even the next morning, is I'm never going to make it through the Bardo, because when we lost everything, the first thing I thought of was this beautiful yellow skirt that I bought in Paris that I'd considered taking with me. And I thought, no, we're going to be out for 3 days. And that was the first thing I thought is it's gone. And that would have sent me right back into the mortal coil of suffering. You just are so shocked that you can't really take it in. And you have no choice. You just have to keep going. You need to buy clothes. You need to buy a cage for your bird. You need to buy a fish bowl for the 2 fish you rescued from the debris soaked pond. There are just so many things in front of you that you have to do that you don't really have too much time to think. And you need to just regroup and resupply. And you have to find a place to live. You just have to surface. And that took a while, and everybody says, oh, you're so strong. Oh, you're doing so great. I thought it was peculiar that I wasn't grieving. I had one big cry on my husband's shoulder about 2 days in. And then I was just like left foot, right foot. And at about 4 months, right around the time when my book was about to come out and everything, I started to get really sad. I started to get very dilated and labile and probably depressed, pretty depressed. So I wasn't immune to it after all, and I wasn't enlightened enough that it was not going to affect me. And I think that one of the problems is, I think the body gives you a grace period. And then when you're ready, you can start to feel stuff. And what happens is that you go to make a dish and you think, oh, I need some sumac. I've got sumac. And like, no, I don't have sumac. It burnt. Or you think, oh, I had that nice little shovel. No, I don't have that shovel. It burnt. And I would say 10 or more times a day, you're saying to yourself, it burnt. Jim and I have this thing where we go, burnt. It's funny, but in a sense, it's also traumatic because you're remembering the fire 10, 12, 20 times a day, which I guess is the definition of a mild PTSD. At the same time, I'm being emotionally dilated to the world, except I tear up at the slightest thing. I see a homeless man, I tear up. I see a dog with 3 legs, I tear up. But I don't mind that. I like being so tender to the world or so raw to the world. Does that answer your question to
Yeah,
some?
as you were going through that, although I've never had anything remotely like this in my own experience, what it conjured up for me was the death of my mother, my father, and my sister, where I'll be going through the day and, oh, I've got to tell my father that. And, oh, I'm going to send that to my sister. And no, burnt, gone. And it's just, you've had them all of your life. And it's just, you're just undermined by their suddenly being gone. And it's so sudden, like the change in your life.
I think that's the definition of grief. I think my experience of grief is that you have to think everything you possibly can about that person or that place before grief is done with you. It's like grief has you by the scruff of the neck and it's, you lost this, you lost that, this is gone, that's gone. And I'm not sure it ever completely lets go. I'm still grieving people that died many years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, more.
Let's talk about Bug Hollow, which is Michelle's new novel just out. It's getting great acclaim all over the place, including the New York Times. It's a novel that I think you said, Michelle, it really started as maybe short stories, but it's character studies where every chapter takes a member of this family and relations and follows them and really brilliantly, I think lucidly, takes their life and shows you the various parts that you need to make sense of them. The detail is astonishing to me. Michelle's gift for showing what a particular culture is like. The one that got me most was 1970s California life, which Michelle and I both lived. But in this book, Michelle does that over and over, including elsewhere, including Saudi Arabia. What's it like to be an expatriate in Saudi Arabia? Michelle, if, as for us here in Fire Philosophy, the overriding questions are ethical ones that are focused on what kinds of lives might we live? How do we become characters that we like? How do we lead in a life that might, in some respects, be admirable, at least from perspective of our own perspective or others near us? Does this novel resonate with those kind of abstract ethical questions? And if it does, which I think it does, how would you say?
Maybe it does. It might be even a little bit sub-ethical. Ever since my second novel really articulated it. In my second novel, James Land, there's a character he's a former chef. He's lost his restaurant. His marriage is gone. He's lost his wife. He's not allowed to see his kid. He's living with his mother, who's a nun, who's a late night nun, who's come out of the convent to live with him. And he stomps around Los Feliz saying, how do people live in this world? So it's not even how do you be a good person in this world, it's how do you just live in this world? But I think that the more comfortable you are with this difficult world is how spiritual you are in a way. How do you find a way to live? And I think that every single one of my characters grapples with it. Like my 20-year-old girlfriend, whose boyfriend of 2 months, she's just with him for 2 months, he drowns. And then 3 months later, she finds out she's pregnant. What is she's a college student? She has no money. She has a new boyfriend already. What do you do? This is, I guess it's an ethical question. And so she has to figure out what she's going to do with this pregnancy. She goes ahead and has the baby and gives it to her old boyfriend's parents. But she needs her mother late in the story to just say, to reassure her and said, you did a beautiful, generous thing. She doesn't think that way. She doesn't think of what she's doing that way. She's just dealing with this very basic question. So I guess I'm separating it in two. How do you just get through? And then how do you know if what you've done is good? I guess I deal with it ever since I was a little girl. I wondered from seeing too many horror movies or something, or hearing about the devil. I wondered, how do you know if you're a good person or if you're claimed by darkness? And I think that's something that I've always been interested in. How do you know if you're a good person? And I think some of my characters really grapple with that. When Sally falls in love with a stonemason at one point, and he's married, and he says to her, I guess I'm going to have to leave my wife and be with you. And her first thought is this kind of like triumph. I beat out a wife of 20 years. And then she's immediately ashamed of herself for having that feeling. And so, what do we do when we have these bad feelings? I'm not in a hurry, even though in my mind, I'm like, oh, thank God for the superego that tells us how to behave the way that we would like to behave rather than what's going on inside of us. And I think my characters grapple with that same sort of thing. A friend of mine wrote that I always land on the side of faith and friendliness and other people and warmth and hope. Do I really think those things? Because I think many other things as well. I'm not always hopeful and faithful and believe in the goodness of people.
Yeah.
It's also the problem of people who think they're good, but then when you examine the consequences of their actions, they seem not to be so great.
Yeah.
Grayness all around us and within. But that you just touched on something that has been really important for us in fire philosophy, and that's the difference between being introspective, being aware of what's going on within you, and not. It can be blissful, although deeply problematic and troublesome, to really pay no attention to questions about who you are, what's going on, or is this feeling one I ought to have or I ought not to have? But you said at a talk that I attended a few months ago about Bug Hall that being a writer of fiction where you're imagining characters forces you to be introspective in a sense, right? You're always riffing off your own life as you're making up other lives. And that theme of self-awareness has been really important for us so far in fire philosophy. Can you elaborate on that?
I think that I'm going to maybe shift the categories again a little tiny bit because being a writer, I always, when I teach this kind of boot camp writing class at UCLA, I divide it into three sections, which is imagination, research, and observation. When I make a character, when I create a character, they all come from me. So they have my DNA more or less, I would say. But I observe people in the world. I think about someone who's like my character and what characteristics they might have. I do what I call the work of imagination, where you have a character, but maybe you don't know, are they married? And if so, what's their spouse like? Even if the spouse doesn't appear in the story, or if the spouse just makes a passing appearance. Or I had a student who wrote a story about a girl who visits her mother in the hospital and then goes on to high school. And I said, why is the mother in the hospital? And she says, I don't know. And I like, you've got to know, because if she's there for a facelift, that's one thing. And if she's there because she has stage 4 cancer, that's another thing. And that's going to affect how she is for the rest of the day. And you have to, that's the work of imagination, to go into and deciding what the mother has and then how that affects. You're really pulling stuff out of yourself. But then if she has cancer, then you have to do a little research to find out where she might be, what kind of cancer, how it's affecting her. So it's such a combination of observation, imagination, and pulling these things out of yourself. But that said, I talk about it as if the imagination is just like this grocery store that you can go in and get stuff off, but it's much more complicated than that. And you can go through dry spells where you lose your contact with that part of yourself, or the relationship sours a bit between you and, is it your unconscious? I always feel weird talking about it because it's such an ephemeral thing, although it's something that you depend on.
Yeah.
Dale, you and I talked quite a lot about, especially at the beginning of Fire Philosophy, the art of living. I mean, it might have been the first thing you wrote, is an act of imagination. And Michelle, if I'm hearing you, what's so fascinating is that even in the act of living, we forget like the most basic thing that we're creating something, our lives in this case. And it's so fascinating that sometimes it leaves us, but then how do you get it back? It's such a mysterious force, or I don't even know what to call it.
When I finished my fifth novel, Search, and before I started this novel, I didn't want to embark on another big project and I wanted to write stories, but I really didn't have any ideas for stories. Then I thought, wait a second, I'm a teacher. I've given prompts to my students for years. So I went and I got all the prompts in one file, 120, 140 of them. And for 43 days, I sat down every morning and I wrote 20 minutes to the next prompt. And I had to write on that prompt. I couldn't go on to the next one. And I had to write for at least 20 minutes. It led me to Bug Hollow, which was also written from a prompt. When I hit the prompt, write about a sibling that you never had, which is a prompt I give to my students, I thought I already wrote to that prompt, and so I'll go look at that story. And that led me to Bug Hollow, which I'd never finished, and then I finished it, the short story. But doing those prompts, it didn't give me that many ideas for stories. When I went back through them, there were maybe 4 or 5 that might turn into stories. But what it did was reestablish that relationship to my unconscious. What I learned was that I'm full of characters. I've got a river of themes and interests and characters up there that I just need to tap in a kind of free associative way. But it established that relationship that wasn't there. I went from having no ideas to having a lot of ideas.
One thing that I've noticed in knowing you, Michelle, is that your powers of observation about people, things, places is really great. And maybe it's just you and being an artist. I picture the writing really drawing that out. You really notice things. And when you meet somebody, you really see things about them that ordinarily people don't. But another huge difference that I finally came to discover is that the difference between thinking that your life is just in this channel and it's just happening and it's as though it's happening to you, and realizing that imagination can really extend those boundaries and send you off in directions that you might not otherwise have realized were possible. The difference between people is enormous and of really great interest to me. Let me go to another theme that is interesting about you and your background, and that's that you're born and raised in Altadena, you're burnt out in Altadena, and now you're hell-bent on rebuilding your home in Altadena. You are an Altadenan, and for those who don't know, this is a part of northern Los Angeles County, right up against the mountains, vulnerable to fire, but beautiful, incredible turn of the 20th century architecture of various sorts, many Spanish style homes, forested, just one of my favorite parts of Southern California. Anyway, you've always been there. And not always, because you've taken trips. You lived in the Midwest, you've traveled all over the world, you've done all these things. How might that affect your writing and your imagination about things?
I've always described myself as a regional writer. My first book took place around the Santa Paula area, and then my second book was around Los Feliz, where I lived at the time. When I was trying to write my third book, which was Blame, I wanted to place it somewhere that had a big downtown hotel. I think I was incubating a novel, but I couldn't start it until I figured out where this book was going to take place. I actually went up and checked out Sacramento. And then one day it was like, why not Pasadena? It's got the big green hotel. It was just staring me in the face. And after that, I just decided that I was going to write about Altadena and where I lived. Although my next book, I did go up to the Sierras where my family had a cabin, which I knew intimately. But I just wanted to write about what I knew. What strikes me again and again, but only periodically, like I forgot about it for a few years, is how that kind of regionalism hampers you in the world of writing. If you're not in New York, it really makes a big difference. Or not on the East Coast, you're really a little bit isolated as a writer. You're not taken as seriously. It's just the whole California, New York thing, which I forget about or I like to believe doesn't exist for the longest time. And then all of a sudden you realize, oh, I don't live in New York. So it affects you. There's a wealth of material in Altadena. I won't begin to touch it in my lifetime. It's the home of artists and soreheads and seekers and mystics, criminals. So historical figures. Is it the best choice as a writer? I don't care. I live there. I'm going to.
I suspect it's the best choice. When you are able to name places and describe trees that are native to Altadena and Southern California, and on clothing and so on, it makes it real. But that's part of your powers of observation. A lot of people live in a place all their lives, and they can't tell you a thing about it, but you see it. All right. I'm going to switch just a slight angle off of that and talk about style. I mean, there's maybe the most famous Nietzsche quote is this one. It starts, giving style to one's character, a great and rare art. It is exercised by those who see all the strengths and weaknesses of their own natures and then comprehend them in an artistic plan until everything appears as art and reason, and even weakness delights the eye. And it goes on in this Nietzschean way about style, choices to be made. And that characterizes your life and the life of many artists who are just making all of these choices about things in their life. It matters to you what kind of shovel you're using in the garden. And for most people, they couldn't care less. But for you, the way you do everything, where you read and eat and cook and ways you garden and take care of your chickens and travel and write, all of these are made to be beautiful and aesthetically real in your life. And some people are puzzled over that. They don't understand why you even think there are choices there to be made. Other artists do that and are that way, not everybody, but I wonder if you have any thoughts about what difference this can make in the living of your life, but also in your writing, what you do as a writer.
I think that some of it is just who you are when you're born. When I was a little girl, the way things looked mattered to me. It didn't matter to the rest of my family. They didn't get it. They didn't really have an aesthetic. I cared. And that kind of set me apart from my family, even from the beginning. But I, I've always seen style as the way you finesse your limitations. You butt up against your limitations and then you have to finesse it. Look at Leonard Cohen. Somebody one time said he mastered the notes of A and B. He does not have great singing range, and yet he's a total genius. People might disagree with me, but I think that he's fantastic. But he does have limitations. And yet, how he finessed them is his style, was his signature style. What other people would be a big talent gap, he made into what we love about him. I think as a writer, you're writing always just up against your own limitations. You're writing at the edge of your vision. And you think as you get to be a better writer that you have more access, but that just keeps going. You're always out of reach of what, at least I am, of what I can actually do. As a writer, that's where my style comes from. I'm just pushing myself and trying new things. Like in Bug Hollow, I did a lot of time swerving, which I haven't really done in my other books. They tend to be horizontal, more narratives, a straight narrative. And this one bounces all over the place time-wise. And I think it's thrilling to leap into the future and then come back, or to make a big jump. I think that's one of the things that Alice Munro gave us, which was she began to swerve through time and people were like, you can't do that, but you can do it. And she did do it. And it became a literary pleasure thanks to her, I think. One of her limitations she'll say is she doesn't, even when she reads a book, she said she didn't read it linearly, that she considers books like houses, And she would start in the middle and or start someplace and read and then go read another place, like visiting different rooms of a house rather than seeing this straight narrative. You, as Christoph said, we're creating ourselves. The world is creating itself. If you believe in God, God is creating God's self. That's standard process theology in a way, I think. I really do believe that every act of living is creative, and that probably results in what you're calling style. In a funny way, I resist it because you make me sound like a yuppie who just lives the beautiful life and buys the most beautiful things, which I don't. I'm still that little girl who's my mom worked. She didn't take us shop. She took us shopping once a year, but I had bags of hand-me-downs from my friend Debbie Macy in the closet, and there would be these fashions that would come even in elementary school, like to have a big puffy skirt. And I didn't have a big puffy slip to make my skirt big and puffy, but I had 5 slips from the bag from Debbie Macy. So I put on 5 slips and I finessed it. So I probably looked a little different. And that was my style. Again, finessing my limitations in order to come up with my own style. And I was so shocked after high school one day when somebody said to me, "Oh my God, you're such an amazing dresser." I'm like, I'm just trying to be stylish with what I have.
Yeah, and now that you say it that way, I realize all of my life I've been a rebel against style. And we're very careful not to be stylish, but that, of course, is a style that's very particular of somebody who's always revolting on the edges. But in Nietzsche's sense, I think it means very much how you described it. And that was really wonderful, that you're out on the edges of your limitations and you're out on the edges of your imagination. You've got these choices to make, and there they are. Why not make them? And why not carve something unique? Because you are unique. And yeah.
When I taught, I went back and taught at the Iowa Writers Workshop, and I had 12 students, every single one of them phenomenally talented. And yet one could not write like the other. You just write like yourself. Each one was so individual, and some you knew were going to become famous writers, and others you knew were going to struggle to get a book published by a small press sometime in their life.
I want to talk about one of your characters, Sib, I think the most interesting one, but they're all interesting. And she comes up and then she disappears for a while in the chapter, and then she comes up, but she's always there in the background. She's this force in the family. The way she's a force is she's a terrible mother. She's mean. She undermines her children's self-confidence. She does things that good mothers do not do, and she does it all the time. And she's a bad spouse. At home, she's just unpleasant. Totally. Nobody would want to live with her. But then she becomes a school teacher, and she's a great teacher, sensitive to every student, finding their talents, finding how to stretch them out, bring them out of their shell. And you just can't believe this is the same person. And although it's rare, this divergence in one character, I've seen it, not in those particular versions, but we've seen it, and where it's just so puzzling. So, how did you come up with this character? How did you imagine she might animate this book through the whole thing, from the very beginning through her funeral? Even if she's dead, she's still governing things in a way. Tell us
Well,
about her.
it's my mother
Whoa.
who says, as Sib says, parents are amateurs and teachers are professional. My mom would say that she likes babies, but then once they got a will on them, she didn't quite know what to do with them, the kids. And I remember at one point in my childhood thinking, like, when did my mother get mean? And I was able to pinpoint it was when my grandmother, my father's mother, who lived around the corner, who my mom was great friends with, when she died. And my mother realized that her vision of life and happiness, which included this wonderful big personality, my grandmother was the neighborhood big personality, mother of everybody sort of thing. She died, and my mom was left with this much bleaker picture of life. And I think that's when she began to get depressed. Then she went back to school and she found something that she really loved. And she became, like I described Sybil, she treated us like annoying roommates. My mother never looked at a single homework assignment she never asked me about my schoolwork or anything, and yet she fussed over her students. And she did have this one student that she tutored at her lunch hour. She saw he was a math savant, and he later went to Harvard, and I put him in the book. He called me a few years ago and said my mother made all the difference in his life. She was the first to see that he had these abilities. She also introduced him to the man who is still his best friend today, who was this elective mute. It was part of her plot to get this, they now call them selective mutes, to talk. She wanted him to talk. And so she decided he needed a friend. So she paired up these two boys. So she really was a great teacher. But as a parent, they also cared a lot about giving us experiences. We went to operas and concerts. We went camping. We drove to Alaska twice. We drove to Guatemala twice. My father was incredibly interested in the world, and that's where I get it, I think. What a mix she was, and how do you sort through that as an adult? Years of therapy is the answer.
That's a place where the arts of meditation, when you just sit there in the Zen tradition and you can watch your mind creating its own characters, and this one in this minute is different from this one. And at some point, there's almost a shock of revelation that, in the maybe Whitman-like sense, that there's these multitudes and none of them are more true than the other. And what do you do with that as a unified self, at least in appearance? It seems like, Michelle, to channel all those parts of yourself or people you've known like that into stories and narratives and see how they play out seems like a very wise endeavor to try to help make sense of things.
I think it does make sense of things, but what you realize as a writer is how much you have to simplify to make the character of Sybil, the mother, that complex a character. I had to eliminate 100 other complexities in a way. I tried to fit them all in, but you really have to simplify in order to get them on the page, because Christoph said they contain multitudes. Everybody contains multitudes. But it was interesting when I was writing this character, the mother, and I was giving it to my friends to read, two of whom were mothers, and they took deep offense that she was so mean. They couldn't believe a mother could be so mean. And I think it struck a chord with them for the moments that they'd been mean. And thank God they said that to me, because then I could add that experience, the fact that she took them to art museums and made them look at a painting for 20 minutes to see what they could see. She had ideas with her kids, but there was this familial stickiness that she couldn't get past. In a family, there's so many inherited anxieties and neuroses, and just who you are from your own parents, and then you see them in your kids and you can't stand it. You have irrational feelings about it. All of that can be perfected when you're a teacher, because you don't have that stickiness. You don't have that, oh, that's a part of me I'd rather not see, and there it is blaring in my child. You can just be your best self. Again, the superego takes over, and you can be the person that you want to be.
I love that line that everyone contains multitudes. That's really a great thought. Your last reference reminds us that the one thing that Freud taught us, maybe that's most important of all the things, or that even the dullest, most simple person is interiorly so interesting and so complicated that we can't even fathom it all. So that we all have these riches that are multitudes within us. It's true.
I think that the thing about Freud that I realized reading this, it focused on this thing that Freud was writing his books while watching his family grow up. and they were based on his own family, what he saw there, including all that family stickiness. So some of that weirdness in Freud is really his own neuroses, his own emotional responses to his own family that he then tries to codify into a scientific theory, which really Adam Phillips, the British psychoanalyst,
Yeah.
and I wrote a short biography of Freud that I found very revelatory because of, I wonder who else is concentrated in looking at Freud's children as children while he was deriving his theories from them.
Interesting. Yeah, so it's clearly, you're putting it that way, makes you a Freudian writer. But I suppose any writer of fiction who's really digging deep into characters, at this point, whether you know a direct Freudian influence or not, it's there in you. You've had an influence on me in that Michelle and I have been part of a book club, Martha and me and Michelle and Jim, two other friends. And up to that point, I had really stopped reading fiction altogether. I was just so busy reading philosophy, just that's all I read. And so we started reading these great classic novels, recent novels, and all these things were coming up to me. The nuance that could come out about a character or an ethical issue in a novel was just far beyond anything you could state philosophically in the abstract, in principle. But once you get down into the detail of a character, it's really rich. And so I'm definitely back into it. And reading you, of course, has been a treat. I loved of your novels. I think Blame is my favorite. I could just resonate with that one. It was powerful. Do you have one that you could show right
That's
there?
right here.
Oh, the cover is great too. 70s station wagon. It's wonderful. The book is really great. I love that the jumping back and forth between characters and time periods. And you remember to remind the reader of who this character was. So you're three-quarters of the way through. This character only came up early. You remind us, and that really brings everything out again, makes you realize, oh yeah, this character has this function. Even though you're jumping back and forth, it all coheres really well. I love it. So, Christoph, what other questions might we have for Michelle?
I have one that fits right into what you just said, Dale. So maybe it's a two-tier question. This constant tension, especially on a university campus, between reading fiction and nonfiction. On one side, just give me the facts or help me do something that's useful with my life, versus why would I waste my time reading imaginary things that don't even exist? And I don't think it's a simple answer, but keep that maybe as the background question, Michelle. Your defense of fiction and fiction writing for the art of living. The question I had that ties in with that is, as of recent times, I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about Socrates. One, because we interviewed Stephen Batchelor, who wrote a book, Buddha, Socrates, and Us. And then I
Mhm.
recently finished another Fire Philosophy guest, Agnes Callard's book called Open Socrates. And in Open Socrates, her first chapter is quite brilliant, I thought. She calls it the Tolstoy problem, in which she describes Leo Tolstoy, who obviously is one of the greats of literature, came up with these unbelievable plots and characters doing all kinds of things. But he himself, as a person in his journal, ends up asking himself a bunch of questions like, what is life for? What is having children for? What is fame for? All this, that, and the other thing. And Agnes Collard, the philosopher, says, interestingly, it looks like Tolstoy is asking questions, but he's not really. So she calls him out on the kind of skating on the superficial. And that led me to think, to try to tie these two questions together. Why fiction? Why bother with fiction? Is it the case in your experience that what fiction allows you to do in some way is to ask the kinds of questions that you otherwise could not ask? Can you
But
speak to that a little bit?
I felt like fiction will answer those questions that you'd rather not live. For example, What happens when you live next door to a bad boyfriend that you broke up with in the worst possible way? Then you get Wuthering Heights and torture of, what is his name? Is it Heathcliff torturing the children of his ex-girlfriend for a couple generations? There's repercussions of this bad relationship that you don't want to live, but you do want to read in a really deep, psychologically intense way. It's very cathartic in a way. So that's one thing that literature can do. It can show you what can happen in a crosswalk without you having to walk willy-nilly into a crosswalk without looking both ways. I was raised on books, which is probably why I write books. My question, how do people live in this world, was a question that I posed every time I opened a book. I was trying to figure out how to be a human being. I was a kid, I was growing and on my own a lot. Books were my pathway into how people thought or felt or acted. So I think that they're very important. And there is the sort of simplistic empathy answer too. Like my agent said, how would you feel about selling the rights of this book? She was selling the foreign rights to Israel or Russia. And I'm like, of course, sell them, because it's through literature rather than through political screed that people understand each other. I think that creates empathy. Although another writer I know said, yes, sell them to Russia. And then Russia came back and said, okay, we'll publish your book, but we're going to censor it heavily. So then what do you do? She didn't,
No.
yeah. But I just believe that literature does communicate things that you can see these amazing playouts of what happens if. I don't know, what happens if you have an affair when you're married? We'll read Anna Karenina before you do.
See, I think you're pointing to something interesting, which is, Dale, you wrote a chapter about reading in your meditations on Zen Buddhism. What does it mean to not really read, or read and call it a deeper or Zen-like way? It seems like most people default to fiction as escapism or entertainment, which is quite unfortunate. But to read in a way where you, entertaining or not, you take it seriously, whether it doesn't even matter if it's comedy or tragedy, but you take the scenario seriously and you generally give yourself an opportunity to, as you were saying, play out the scenarios. It seems like there could be an interesting self-reflexive loop where these imaginary beings actually teach you something profound. Like that's possible through fiction.
I think they widen your emotional field or your what possible ways to think and to feel.
I think I'm not getting the exact words, but there's a line from the Analects of Confucius: to learn without thinking is unfortunate. And so, in other words, to read without really thinking about what you're reading is unfortunate. And on the other side, to think without learning is deeply problematic. In other words, to just think on your own as though you're the first person to think about these things without reading and finding out what others have to say, that's a huge mistake. So that you do both in conjunction, and hopefully reading, you're thinking all the way through, like you're imagining along with the author, and often different directions, and introspecting. What does this mean to me? Those
It does.
questions really bring reading alive.
In the act of writing Bug Hollow, did your own characters teach you anything?
I would say yes. Part of it is just simply objective. When I told my friend, the novelist Lily Tuck, that I was writing about this family and the dad worked in Saudi Arabia, she immediately said, oh, he should have an affair in Saudi Arabia. And I thought, no, he's a family guy. He's a really nice guy. He's the last person to have an affair. And so then I had to go deep in his character to find out who he would have an affair with. I was intrigued. I wanted to figure it out. How does it happen? Who is this person that could be such a patient, tolerant, loving father and spouse that he would get tempted to tempted is a bad word, but he makes friends with a deep friendship with someone very quickly. He meets somebody and connects on kind of a soul level. And he had to show me what it takes in a way that I had to go into the character, and I learned from him what it takes. And also early on in the story, when he's about to go to Saudi Arabia, someone who lives there says, "Oh, there are wild times in Saudi Arabia. I can't believe you're sending your husband there on his own because he might get pounced on by a woman." And she's, "Phil, are you kidding? Don't make me laugh," she says. It's so impossible for him. And that probably planted a little seed but just to figure out how he came about. But sometimes they're good, or they see something in a way that I wouldn't. These characters have a life of their own. They do teach me things.
Yeah. I have to say, Michelle, when Phil had the extramarital relation, I wasn't surprised at all. I was thinking, like, it's about time, dude. You're in this marriage that's just torture. That was his
Yeah,
opportunity.
he's a caretaker, so it probably wasn't complete torture to him. It was probably somewhat of a challenge for him.
Yeah, and he took it on brilliantly.
And he did have some happy years.
Especially in trips and doing things and family things. We should probably bring this to a close. Unless, do you have a question for us? Is there anything you want to say other than what we've done?
No, but I thought both of your questions were very thought-provoking and interesting and deep, which I appreciate.
Yeah.
You know.
As were your answers. Those were really wonderful reflections. Thank you very much, Michelle Huneven, and we recommend to readers check out Bug Hollow, not to mention other novels. She's great. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Michelle.